So just to go back where we started. So we started here with the find updated COBOL forms job. So here we indicated the form ID and the destination table ID that we want to map the form to. So now that we fixed this glitch, so here if we go back to activity history, we had this run for the job to create the job for writing survey data. So what this does is it created the job to write the data from this specific sharks and rays form that we shared to the database. So if I go over to jobs, we're looking for WCS test sharks and rays. And here we go. Here it is. That's been automatically generated. I will zoom in a little bit because I think it must be very small to see. So if we click into the job and look at the details a little bit, I'm going to go scroll down and look at these upserts. So this is where the interesting things happen. Remy, if you look at this bit, for example, when we have this WCS test sharks and rays, so this is the destination table ID. Do you recognize some of these field names?
Yes, I do.
So these are directly, if I can just go over to the COBOL form. Here's your sharks and rays form. So here we have the original fields that we want to map. So, for example, the landing site name and so on. So this job that was automatically generated, what it does, for example, on this line, is just takes the landing site destination column in the database and puts the value of whatever someone answered to the landing site question, the landing site field in the COBOL form here.
Okay.
So it's the same logic with all the columns, and here we get to the infamous repeat group. So this is this part will update the table that holds the information about the boats that were used for fishing.
Okay.
So to recap, well, what this job will do is once there are submissions in the COBOL form, and those submissions are fetched by OpenFN, then this is the job that is going to take those submissions and write them to the destination tables. So we looked at a little bit at the job that was that is used for getting these data, fetching the form responses, fetching the form submissions from COBOL. So next, what we will need to do is, if there are submissions to this form, then we have to add this form to the job so that it finds the form and fetches the submissions. So I don't think this one has any. So if you want to, Remy, you can create a test submission here at the collect data bit, so that we can test fetching the data to this form later.
Okay, that sounds good.
Cool.
Hi everyone, I'm back. No mean to interrupt if you're still walking through it.
Yeah. No worries. We just looked at the automate cyclic created job. So just looked at the mappings a little bit, and we just said that Remy could create a sample submission that we can fetch later and write with it.
Awesome. So we ready to move on from automation? Any other last questions or potential use cases to walk through? Nope. Cool. Well, thanks, Rita, for walking us through that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk a little bit about getting back to custom integration. Cool. So can you all see my screen, the slides?
Yes.
So you might remember way back to the start of the training, we had these different use cases that we might commonly look at. So to date, we've been mostly exploring that third column, this rapid deployment. So let's say we don't know anything about databases. We quickly want to get a form up and running in a database. We want to see that data syncing. This is great for getting things up and running quickly. Great if you don't have a lot of experience configuring database applications, but you still want to get information into a slightly structured way into a database, but not so great if you do have a really specific data structure that you want to be mapping to, or multiple different destinations that you want to be mapping to with each one has their own data structure. And so in that case, that's where we're probably going to be looking at more of a custom integration option. And that could be something that, maybe you're building yourself from scratch entirely. Maybe you're working with some other partner organizations to design and to deliver, or maybe you're using some standard forms that don't have an existing integration. So if you are using basic necessities survey or the natural resource governance tool with WCS, we kind of partnered implementing that, and at least across their different form versions, have that integration solution up and running, so that way it can be borrowed by any ConSoSci Connect member to also integrate those standard forms. But those are really only 2 survey forms. So if you're dealing with any other type of survey form and your database has a specific structure that you want to map to, then you might consider going this custom route where you're building your own integration. And what we talked about a little bit in the last hour was you might use the automation solution as a template and then customize off of that. Or you might decide that it's actually more time efficient just to build from scratch. So that's what we're going to start to get into over the next couple of days is how do we build from scratch? How do we leverage all these different open function features? And just to recap these use cases, you for these integrations, you might be syncing one source to multiple destinations. So that could be both ConSoSci Connect and the destination system of your choice, or you might also be syncing multiple data sources to one destination, or multiple data sources to many destinations. So no matter your inputs and your outputs, you have some of these solutions available to you to consider, what you might want to reuse, or which ones you might want to be built from scratch. But again, I just want to emphasize that with OpenFunction, we really emphasize reusability. So even if the automation solution doesn't seem like a good fit, a good place to go is to go to GitHub and again, to check out that ConSoSci repo. And the documentation site provides, over here, you'll see the link here, provides an overview of all the different solutions, but you'll see each of these folders here have a different set of jobs that you might look at. So for example, with BNS, we have a couple different jobs that were used to map different surveys that we were using. So we have this BNS survey job that is mapping BNS surveys to a specific database structure. So you can check out this job here if you maybe wanted to reuse the same database structure and the same mappings if you're using these standard forms. Similarly, we have that for NRGT. There's also been some other forms that have come up like vegetation and all that. So you can continue to check back to this repo. And if you ever see job code that you like and you're like, I want to use this as a template, you can always copy and paste and get this set up in a new OpenFN project. So you can use this as a template as well. And then OpenFN generally comes, we have lots of repositories and lots of different partners, and a lot of our partners are pretty good about sharing their job code. So you can also peruse just generally the organization, the repo, just to see what some other organizations are doing to connect to their systems. So if you're using Postgres, for example, you might search Postgres here, and you can see all sorts of other repositories that might also be using Postgres for integration, just to see a little bit of how they've implemented the integration. So that's just a plug for checking out the resources that are already there. So even if you're not using the automation solution, think about if there are existing integration solutions that you might be able to leverage. But even if not, and if you want to start entirely from scratch, that's still possible with OpenFN, and we still try to fast track that process for you. So what I want to do right now is I want to talk a little bit more about this BNS specific use case, and just going to talk about this process of mapping to these very specific destinations. So maybe just to bring in the more business, the functional context, I'm wondering, Diane, would you maybe be willing to share a little bit of for folks that are listening in, kind of what the basic necessity survey is, why WCS wanted it all in one place, just to give a little bit more of the real world context to it?
Yeah, sure. So the basic necessity survey is the tool that we use to measure the impact of our interventions on human well-being. And we've started using it in Central Africa, and it expanded in other countries in Africa. And I know other projects in other continents use it as well. And we were initially using paper and access databases on each site. And it was really annoying to have to, work on each access database to do some analysis. And so when we went for digital data collection and cloud-based database analysis, we just wanted to be able, to do some have one script that can analyze everything and be able to tweak, add analysis whenever we wanted, and have cross-cutting analysis over several landscapes for several years. And so that's why we have those big tables that have all the BNS data from everyone around the world for the last 6 years. And this way it's much easier to do analysis and to make decisions. We're working on some dashboards where you can select your landscape, or your district or your village, select the year, and you can have really nice graphs and visualization for basically any landscape.
Awesome. And Diane, I guess, what does your database look like? Like, it sounds like you have all these visualizations and stuff like that. Is there like a very defined data model and a lot of thought put into that?
So it varied for over the last few years, because the first database was built in partnership with another organization, and then we moved over to our own database. And so there are a few tables also because of confidentiality. We try to not have all the data in a single table, but to have like sensitive information in different tables. And so we have, we have like a table for the basic goods and services that people have. We have a table for natural resources. We have different tables for different information. And then we have, it took us a long time to think about what analysis we wanted to see, what graphs, what filters and everything. So it was quite a long thinking process.
Gotcha. So I have up on my screen at least what was your data model at one point in time, and maybe it shifted a little bit, but it looks like in your database you kind of had this table where you're capturing just information about the COBO forms and like where that data is coming in, then the actual answers that were provided on that BNS survey, and then there was answers specifically to household members on another table, then GS, and what is GS?
Yeah, so the GS is the goods and services, so what actually people say that they have and think they are necessary. And in COBO, this is represented in a very like flat and annoying table, very, very long. And so we transformed it to have, for each, like for a machete, this household, does it have it? And do they think it's necessary? That's the GS. And then you have the HH members for all the people in the household. And the GPS separated for security measures.
Gotcha. So then we're keeping that location data on a separate table. So that way, if we're providing access or running queries on that main answer table, we can segment that out. Cool. So for folks kind of watching in, like, a lot of thought goes into a data model when you're building in your own custom data model. So that's why if you're new to data modeling, you haven't done this much before, or not sure exactly what your analysis output should be, that's why the automation solution could be a good fit to start. But for those of you that are maybe mapping to an existing database or have put a lot of thought into some of those data security considerations or these exact relationships you might want to draw across these different tables and elements, then you might want to configure a very specific data model to optimize those different use cases and requirements. So that was the case with BNS. So thanks, Diane, for sharing. And so for implementing kind of this integration, we had to take this COBO form definition and we had to transform that form structure to match this specific data model. And so to do that, it was a process of figuring out how do what we call map these data elements. So I know a lot of times when we hear the word map, we think of a nice world globe with little pins and stuff like that. But for the context of this training, when I say map, I'm talking about assigning data elements between systems and prescribing how those data elements should be transferred from one system to another. So a simple assignment might be if in our BNS survey, we're asking for name, district, maybe location, a couple other questions. We might want to think about how name and district and other data map to our database table. And in our database table, if we have different columns such as participant, location, and column, there's a bit of business analysis that needs to be done to figure out, how do I take the data from one system and make sure that it outputs in my destination system exactly how I want it to. And this exercise of assigning these data elements and understanding how they should be assigned and transform, this is what we call data element mapping, or just mapping for short. So I might want to map name to the participant column in the database. I want to map district to the location column. And these are examples of just really simple mappings or very simple assignments of data elements. But mapping can be really complex as well. It can be, depending on your inputs. Maybe if location is Nairobi, we have a third column called country that we want to assign Kenya. Or if location is Maputo, then country becomes Mozambique. So it might get a little bit more complicated, where based off of answers for one value, we might output additional values or different values. Some other examples of things you might achieve in this mapping exercise is thinking about how you want to transform your values. So for example, in your survey, if you're capturing all of your data as yes/no questions, but in your database, you want it to output as binaries or coded answers as like ones and zeros, then you might entirely transform that data. So to kind of relabel or recode, or you might even want to automate some data cleaning steps. So for example, if people enter all sorts of weird uppercase and lower cases, maybe you want to clean that text input, or provide some additional formatting. So long as you can describe a rule for how information should be taken from one system and entered in another, then you can look to automate this mapping or this data processing step. And so that's what we're about to get a little bit into, is like how do we map data elements? Because if you're going to go your own custom integration option, or even if you're still evaluating, do I use this automation solution? Do I build my own custom integration solution? Just from like a functional data use perspective, if you can clearly articulate how data in one system should be transferred to another, then you can begin to understand, what your integration requirements are. Then evaluate, whether you can use an OpenFN or ConSoSci out-of-box solution, or whether you need to go your own route. So this is what we're going to talk through right now, is how do we map. But before I move forward, any quick questions on just what mapping is at a high level?
I have a question on transformation, but maybe are we going to talk a bit in more details about transformation later?
Yeah, we are.
Okay.
But do you have is it a use case or a very specific question?
Yeah, no, it's well, a bit specific. So I've been asked if we could, for example, automatically change the name of the photos taken, and I've looked into doing that in Kobo, and it's not possible. And so the idea is like to take, for example, so Kobo puts an automatic ID on each picture that is a unique number, with number. And so they would like to have the species, take the species name, for example, the number of the picture, the angle of the picture, and the name of the today date, and the name of the market or the landing site. Is that something feasible in OpenFN?
Great question. I'm going to turn it back to you. So
I think it is.
so the rule is that there's got to be a clearly defined and repeatable rule. So if you all are thinking about, is this possible with OpenFN? Is it possible to send data in this way? Is it possible to reformat, to clean data in certain ways? Ask yourself, is there a clearly defined and repeatable rule that someone could follow your explicit instructions and execute repeatedly? And I always like to think of OpenFN as your very dumb data entry clerk. And so OpenFN is great, super fast, can automate everything, but OpenFN can only do what you tell it to do. And so let's say you're sitting down with OpenFN next to you, and you have these CSVs of Kobo data, and you need to get it into your database. Are there some sort of instructions that you can write down on paper to tell OpenFN exactly how to take that CSV export, for example, and input that into your database? So Diane, for your specific use case, where you have maybe an export of data where you have all these interesting names for photos, is there a rule for how OpenFN should read those names and then rename them?
Yeah, I guess so. It's just taking some other fields that were collected to concatenate and create a new name.
Gotcha.
And replace the photo ID with that new name.
Okay. So like if we had data where we see there's a photo, maybe every time OpenFN says, hey, if you see the photo, don't enter the photo name, but rather create a new name and use form name and submission date or something like that. Does something like that work?
Yeah, will work.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I think some other great examples of transformation are like some of these other ones that I talked about, like relabeling. So like if location is Nairobi, then output Kenya as a country. So a lot of these like if then criteria, but it could be more complex. Like if there is a response, do this type of action. You know, it just, again, so long as you could, like, if you could sit down and very clearly like write or type out a rule, then the chances are that we can probably automate that with OpenFN. Does anyone else have questions or ideas for maybe like some sort of data cleaning or transformation steps they've come across? Alrighty, well, we'll get into some more. And so the goal of this exercise is making sure that you can functionally describe how information in one system should map to another. So I want to emphasize again that this does not have to be a technical exercise. It's not necessarily an exercise for developers. A lot of times when we're working with partners, these are conversations we're having with business users or folks that are using the data. And understand the data and know what data they want the format in so they can easily use it. And then if you work on this specification of how these different data elements should map and maybe be transformed, then what you can do is you can go back to your technical team or you can sit down yourself with these requirements, and this will set you up to write your own job from scratch or just set up your own OpenFN integration from scratch. And so really this mapping specification is your blueprint for your integration. So we're going to talk through kind of how do we build one, what might it look like, go do some practice around that. But just keep that in mind that this does not have to be a technical exercise. It could be an exercise just for functional, business users, and a good way to engage other people on your team, particularly if there's folks that are really invested in what that analysis should look like, or really invested in how they built the Kobo form and how they want that data to be interpreted. A lot of times it might be more of a negotiation of what the data means and like translating meaning between the two systems rather than the technical bits and pieces. Awesome. So let's talk mapping, because that's exactly what we did with the BNS survey. Is we had this Kobo survey. We went through this exercise of, we have this Kobo survey, we have this very interesting specific data model. How do we map to it? Went through this mapping exercise. We're able to then spin up some jobs. And what we'll look at today is just kind of like how do we design, and then on Wednesday we're going to talk through like how do we actually look at this in the OpenFN platform. But up on my screen here, you can see a screenshot. On the right, we have an OpenFN BNS job. So if you go to the GitHub repo and you check out BNS folder, you can see that job there. And what we're doing in that job, you can see on that line 102, we are upserting, we're inserting records in that Kobo BNS answer table. And what we're doing is we're taking data on the left, so whatever we get from Kobo. So on the left, we get ID, we get all these different BNS questions, and then we're telling OpenFN, where that data should go in the database. So then we're saying, okay, when Kobo gives us an ID, we want to map that to the answer ID column. When Kobo gives us a landscape, we want to map that to the landscape column. But occasionally in these jobs, as you're perusing the repo and checking this out, you might see some JavaScript thrown into those job scripts. And that's when we're doing some custom manipulation or data transformation to align with our mapping specifications. So any guesses on the right, on line 105, what we're doing there? Last update. What are we mapping to last update? So last update's a column in the database. What are we putting in that column?
The date.
Yeah, exactly. And today's date right now. So as the job is running, we're creating a new date, and that's a little JavaScript function there. And then what it's going to do is going to output a date. So that way, when we go and update the database, the last update is today's date. So that's like a little custom logic we're doing there. What about line 106? Any guesses what this is? This is like some real JavaScript going on. This is what we call a ternary operator. It kind of does this if-then checking. Any guesses?
So it looks at the today date. If it exists, then it takes this today as the survey date. And if it doesn't exist, it takes the submission time.
Exactly. Kudos. You just read JavaScript. Amazing. And so if you all see state in any of these job codes, so if you're reviewing existing OpenFN solutions, that's a hint that we're about to manipulate the state of the data as we receive it. So on the left of the screen, this is what Kobo sends us. This is the current state of the Kobo data. And in the job script, what we might do is we might manipulate that state. So for line 106 in particular, this is a use case where some Kobo forms have today as a specific question in the Kobo forms. Some only have submission time. So we're first checking if there's a today value. And if there is, we're returning that today value, and that's what we want to send to the database. But if not, we'll default to submission time. So that's just another example. If you look on line 116, it's the same operator at play again. So it looks like there's this column household type control. And so if the household type is set to be control in the Kobo survey, then we return a 1 value in the database. And otherwise, we're returning a 0 value. We're saying, no, this is not a control household. So these are just some very basic JavaScript functions. If you all stick around for some of the trainings next week, we're going to get into some of these more advanced transformations and all that. But this is just to showcase you a little bit of some standard mapping. We have all these columns on the left and then these data values on the right that we're pulling from Kobo. But occasionally we want to do some small edits or transformations or cleaning. But no need to worry about that now. We're going to just talk about it functionally to start. But any quick questions here?
I have a question. What's the difference between 105 and 107?
105 and 107. So 105, that's where we are creating a new date. So we want to set today's date as the date. So we're saying whenever we go update the database, we want to update last update to today's date. But survey date is rather mapping today as specified in the Kobo form. So that could be the day that the survey was collected. So, the survey could have been collected a month ago, and maybe we're doing this historical sync. So when that survey enumerator was filling out the survey today was, March 1st, but now it's already April. So that's referencing the data that comes in. So what was submitted from that Kobo survey, if that makes sense.
So today is not necessarily today. It's like the data when the data was the data when the data was collected.
Yes, today as recorded in the Kobo survey. So this is getting a little hectic. But you see on the left on line 83, there's that today, and it's a 2020 date.
Yes.
So that survey was collected on October 2020. So we want to record that survey date happened in October 2020. But today, when we're uploading it to the database, we're uploading this data, April 2021. So this is ways that you just might, you want to capture the raw data and like the state of that data whenever it was collected. And then there are times where you want to input things that are relevant, now, or after the data is collecting and you're analyzing, we want to add some more information to it.
Yeah, thanks.
And so when we do some data cleaning on an ongoing job, then every time the data is cleaned, it's resent to Kobo. And so we have this, we know when the updated form is sent using the last update, right?
Exactly. So like this last update is kind of this additional audit provision. So you can see exactly when OpenFN sync the data, as well as if the data was clean, as Diane just said, then okay, this data was collected in October, but it was just updated yesterday. Why? And then you go, oh, well, maybe they cleaned the data since then. So just some additional auditing to help folks investigate. Cool. So we'll come back to this, but just if you're starting to peruse the GitHub repo and take a look at what's there, state is the hint that we're modifying the state of the data as we receive it. So what you see when we go fetch data, those messages in your OpenFN inbox, those provide you a state of that data in that point in time. So when we go and fetch a submission today, we see what that data looks like today. But if someone in Kobo goes and cleans that submission, we need to go fetch it again to get that new state of the data. So if someone cleaned the data, there's going to be a new state to be looking at. So that's just something to kind of start to think about, is that, data isn't static necessarily. So when we get these data, we're always capturing kind of the most recent state, and then we want to pass that onwards to our destination system and sometimes manipulate that state. We don't want to directly assign values, but rather we want to do some sort of transformation or cleaning to optimize our analysis. So that's what we're going to talk through functionally today. Any other quick questions here? And you've heard me throw out the word state. So again, state, this is just like your message or your data. So given some data from Kobo, and that's that current state of the data, that comes in this JSON format. We can then write instructions for how to process that data using jobs. And we can write these job expressions, using these helper functions, or we can write it in raw JavaScript. But given that we have this incoming data, given that we have a job and a way to connect to our destination system. So we know what adapter we're using. Are we connecting with a Postgres database? Are we connecting with some sort of other application? And do we have a way of logging in to that destination? Do we have some sort of login details or credential? Then OpenFN can take all these things. It can take your data, it can take your instructions, and then the destination, and it can just automatically start processing. And so just like, again, you want to think about your data entry clerk. If you give them, your CSV export, a list of instructions of how to upload that to your cloud system, and you gave them login details on how to log into your database and enter in all that information, they can get to work. So that's kind of the same type of concept here, is that you need to give OpenFN kind of the inputs and the outputs and the instructions. So that way OpenFN can also start to automate all these steps for you. And so that's where we're going to talk a little bit about data design and data element mapping. So I'm going to come back to jobs here. But I think the key thing that I want to emphasize is, again, that you don't need to be a developer to design jobs. This all comes down to being able to really clearly distill the logic for how data should be transferred from one system to another. And this is tricky. This is hard. Mapping is actually quite a hard exercise. I think a lot of folks are like, oh, you just take it here and you put it there. But there's a lot of devil in the details and trying to figure out how exactly do you make sure that information fits into another system, but also shows up in a way that is meaningful and can be used by that system and those users. But just remember and keep in your mind that if you can clearly write out that rule, you could probably automate it through OpenFN. So that's the thing to keep in mind. So step one for mapping. Let's say we have a new Kobo form and we have some sort of custom database that we want to map to with a very specific structure. What you can do is you can start to work on this integration design. So if you have your Kobo form and you have your destination, great. Now I can start to think about how do the specific data elements, so the different questions in my Kobo form, map to my database. But before we even get into the specific question by questions analysis, something that we recommend is even just at a higher level, making sure that you understand your higher level data flows. So for you, if you're just mapping one form to a database, it might be very straightforward. You might have one arrow if you were to draw this out on a piece of paper, and I recommend you do that, like pull up a piece of paper, a little napkin, just kind of sketch out what this data flow looks like. And it could be as simple as my diagram at the bottom, but maybe you have one Kobo form that we're just mapping to one database. But then you might have scenarios where actually you have many different forms that are mapping to the same database. So maybe I'm collecting sharks and rays data, but perhaps I have 5 different versions of that form that are slightly customized to different locations. Maybe the questions that I'm asking in Tanzania are a little bit different than what I'm asking in Mozambique. So I have slightly different surveys, but ultimately they need to go to the same database. And in that case, you might have multiple Kobo forms mapping to one database. Or you might even have, one or multiple Kobo forms mapping to multiple destinations. So they don't need to just get to one database, but they also need to get to another database that maybe has a different data structure. And so first thing that you should do is kind of just sit down, make sure you have a clear understanding of what are your inputs. Is it actually one form? Is it many versions of the form? Is it one database? Is it many databases? And then once you have this high level data flow, then you can start to understand, okay, cool. Is there one integration that can service all of this, or am I actually building maybe 2 integrations? One between Kobo and my database, and one between Kobo and ConSoSci Connect, as an example. So really just encourage you when you're getting started, really lay out all your inputs and your outputs and draw these arrows just to define kind of, what are these different flows that need to happen, because usually every data flow is going to translate to a different job. So every arrow you see on my screen here, this is a job. And so with the example on the left, we have a job to get Kobo data and pull it into OpenFN, and then we have a job to load that into a database. On the diagram on the right, same thing, we might be getting data from Kobo, and then we might have one job to load it into one database with a specific structure, and then a second job to load it into ConSoSci Connect. So that should be your output of this first data design phase. So I'm curious for folks on the call, are you currently going through this process right now? Like Jesse, you mentioned maybe doing some work on sharks and rays. Do you have any sense of, is this one Kobo survey? Is it a survey with many different versions? Do you know what those inputs look like yet?
Not really. I think Remy is in a better place to talk about that. Although we're planning to use Kobo to design a Kobo form that we'll be using to collect fish landing data. I think I started the process, but it's technically we'll be having data collection from different sites, and we hope to receive the data in one database for ease in terms of analysis, data cleaning, and the final output. So it will be the same form, but collection is done in different places, but we're hoping to use the same form for those different places.
Okay, so even though it's the different places, hopefully just one form definition. So then it sounds like maybe one input. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and Remy, anything to add on your side, or anything that you're seeing with the sharks and rays?
In my case, maybe Leanne would know better, but I know there are many countries that are going to be using Kobo. So the idea is, if all this information is going to be in one database, how will it, if you're coming from different sources, like how will it all come into one place? Yeah,
Gotcha.
so, but the database, I guess the database would have the same structure because all forms are the same, yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The way the form was created is that, so initially, like all the countries were collecting data using different tools and different forms, and so we spent a lot of time working on this and on a master form that has like all the questions needed. I mean, the minimum, let's say the minimum standard that, you know, we want to have for sharks and rays monitoring. And so this is like, we have this master form is the one that we shared with you. And then each country will like switch off some questions that they don't need. And so there's one, only Tanzania started data collection, and then the other countries are still thinking about, you know, what question they want to switch off, and they haven't started data collection yet. But the next step is to map this master form to the database. And actually using the same process as what we do for the vegetation.
Gotcha. So it sounds like y'all are lucky to be coordinated about it and to have that one master form, so that one input. But yeah, I'm curious, have any of you come across scenarios where maybe you're using different survey versions about the same type of data?
Yeah, I mean, we do, sorry, my dog is a bit messy, but we do have a lot of surveys actually where people do change the questions. And so, for example, we have this set of surveys around bushmeat consumption, offtake, wild meat offtake and things like that, where, you know, because, for example, the hunting models are very different from a country to another. One form that was built for to fit a certain hunting model is not really appropriate for another country. And so the survey ends up being quite different when it's actually about the same kind of data, and would like the data to be together in a database, in a table.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I've seen that a lot too, when you like really need to localize a form. Maybe you really want to tailor it to that specific group that you're surveying, or country specific things. So maybe you're pulling common indicators or data responses from across all forms. So in theory, you can have two forms where, let's say, each was 30 questions. And then from each one, you're only pulling 10 questions that are kind of standard questions. That could be another way to think about, you know, collecting, you know, tapping into two very different inputs and mapping it to one database. Or there might need to be work to transform one of the inputs to match the other one. And that's where your mapping might just have a lot more logic and things like that to almost de-customize whatever that initial thing was, and to translate it to something a bit more universal that can be analyzed centrally. So it sounds like, you know, both use cases, at least in the WCS scenario, but, you know, on their side, I think largely it sounds like trying to translate things into one input to make this mapping exercise a bit more straightforward. Because if you have lots of inputs, it's certainly doable to map all of those inputs to a database. But just something to keep in mind is that that's a lot of separate data flows that you might need to maintain. So if you have 7 different form versions that all need to map to the same database, you have to do this mapping exercise perhaps 7 different times, just to think about how your input should go into your outputs. And then if you add a question across some of these forms, you might need to be checking, okay, cool, where did I add that question? How does that change my mapping logic for those? So something just to consider, particularly the Kobo context, is if, you know, you do have lots of inputs, it is a bit more work to integrate, rather than if you're just tapping into 1 or 2 sources. So hopefully, you know, not too much work if you're using the same form templates and versions, but certainly a consideration to keep in mind when determining level of effort for this type of endeavor. Any questions or comments on just kind of mapping data flows? All right. Well, once we have these inputs and these outputs defined, next steps are actually getting into the field level. So like actually mapping individual data elements. So now that I've picked my form, let me review the form, let me review the questions I'm asking, and figure out how to fit it into this database. And so one way that we see doing about that is we build a mapping template. So it's like this Excel spreadsheet, which I'll show you in a second, where you can actually start to document this blueprint of what inputs look like and how you want it to output. But what you're doing in this exercise is you're trying to align the metadata between your systems. So you have a Kobo form definition, which you can go and you can export, and you might have this database model. So if you're not clear on, we've talked a lot about Kobo, we talked a lot about getting the Kobo data, and I'll walk you through that. But if you're not clear on what your output needs to look like and what that data model looks like, this is going to be a tricky process. So if you're sitting down to map something and you're trying to figure out how to fits into that database structure, I really encourage you to reach out to your team or to get access to that destination system that you're mapping to. So that way you can really begin to understand that metadata and that structure of that database that you're mapping to. So I find it really helpful to have even like an ERD or a schema, some sort of visual diagram that shows me the table architecture and the relationships. Super helpful if you have a full list of the metadata somewhere. So if someone can just generate, that SQL export for you and get you that list of all the tables and columns in the database, that's also a really helpful way. But on the Kobo side, what we can do is we can export the metadata of our Kobo form. So any guesses on how to do that? How do I get my Kobo form definition? Remy, Jesse, have you guys had to do this before, where you have to like go and see what questions are already in your Kobo form?
I think you can go to, just click on any of the forms, maybe if it's fish landing, and then you can go to form.
Awesome.
And then you can, yeah.
Cool. So then if you're viewing your Kobo form, you'll see this more actions. There is this option to download your form. So then you can export your form. And what that will do is it will package up your questions, your labels, if you have translations, if you have drop-down lists, all those choices. So you might remember on the last call, we kind of walked through this a little bit in the last training of just that anatomy of the Kobo form. So I'm just going to go ahead and open this up here just to show you folks again. But this is usually the easiest way to just get that Kobo metadata. So if you remember kind of walking us through this, we have survey, settings, and if there's a survey with options for questions, let me find another one. If you like drop down questions or multiple choice questions in your survey, there will also be choices that are provided. So let me go ahead and pull the Sharks and Rays one. So I'm going to go to Sharks and Rays, form, download XLS to get that form definition. I'm going to spin that up. And then, yeah, for Sharks and Rays, we have lots of drop down questions. So I see 3 tabs. Do you all see this Excel sheet here on my screen?
No.
Okay.
Not the sheet.
Great. How about now?
Yeah.
Awesome. So for this one, we have our survey. So these are like all the questions in our Kobo form. We have our choices. So these are like these standard drop-down lists that we might choose from. And then we have settings, which just tell us about the Kobo form and the title and all that good stuff. So if you export your form definition, it looks like this. Charlotte, what is type? What is this type column?
Sorry, I was on mute. It's the type of question, or more the type of response we're going to collect.
Exactly. So this is where Kobo allows you to define data types. So Kobo has its own set of data types, which you can go read about. Kobo has some pretty good documentation on form building, and I know ConSoSci specifically has a lot of resources, some which are linked through on that key concepts tab. But there's some standard data or question types. So like you can capture the start and end of a response, the today's date to capture the submission date. There's geo point for geolocation. There's also select one. which is like a drop-down list where someone can select options. So if they want to select which country, they might have a list of countries to choose from, and they can select one. And that select one country, if we flip over to choices and look at country, here are the different choices that we see. So we see Kenya, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania. These are different country options. There's also what we talked about with repeat groups. This is where it allows us to group questions and ask them multiple times. So in this example for sharks and rays, a lot of times we ask about boats. And so someone might have many boats that they want to tell you about. So therefore we ask, different set of questions for every boat. There's integers, there's text values. So it's lots of different questions here. But those are kind of, the types are documented here. And what about name? What is the name column versus label? What's the difference here?
The names are what is the names is what is going to be reflected on the database, but the label is not what you'll be seeing when you get to the forms.
Exactly. So who does see the label, Jesse?
Sorry?
Who does see the label? Why does label here? Who actually sees the label?
The label, the admin, I think.
The admin and anyone, actually the enumerator. So whoever's collecting the data. So if you're opening up Kobo on your mobile phone and you want to see what a survey looks like, or even in this option where if I want to collect data online and if I click open, what I'm seeing here on the front end, once it loads, you'll see are the labels. So I see GPS, I can see country, I can see, are you surveying a landing site or market? So this allows us to, really write out questions in a way that are friendly to whoever the data collectors are. But then name, as Jesse rightly said, that's what we see on the back end. So here we have this really nice, lovely label. Are you surveying a landing site or market? But the question name is just survey. And so when you all are looking at mapping your Kobo surveys to a destination, this is the data elements that you want to be mapping. You want to be looking at these question names because this is what we're able to fetch through the API. So you want to tell OpenFN what to do with landing site, how to take landing site and to map that to your destination database. So this is the column we're most interested in. Label gives us more information about what was being asked in that question. So sometimes it's helpful because if I'm looking at just survey, I'm like, I don't know what about the survey? What information are you collecting? And then if I look at the label, oh, okay, they're asking, where are we serving the folks? Are we serving in a landing site or in a market? So when you're configuring your Kobo forms, it certainly helps if your names are descriptive, but the labels are there to provide that extra context for folks as well as, different languages. But no matter the language, name is consistent and is the unique identifier for that question. So that's what we want to tell OpenFN to use as a key to extract data from Kobo. So if we want to load, survey type information into the database, we don't need to know the full question. We just need to know this unique name. Data type is also sometimes helpful to pull into our mapping because it might inform how we decide to map this information. So for example, if for boat info, it looks like we have a yes/no question. But in my database, let's say I know it's a binary, it's a 1-0 or a true/false. Then this might be a hint that, hey, anytime you get a yes, you might need to convert that to a true value or to a 1. And every time you get a no, you need to convert that to a false or to a 0. So data values or data types give us hints around maybe some sort of data cleaning or data transformation steps we might need to do. So when I'm doing a mapping exercise and I'm thinking through, okay, like how do I get all this information from Kobo to my database? What I'll often do is I'll copy over the type and name and also label if I think that will be helpful. And what I'll do is I'll put this into a new spreadsheet. And we're gonna share with you all this example in a minute. but I might have a spreadsheet like this. Can you all see my Google Sheets again?
Yeah.
Cool. This is what you see. It's kind of a draft mapping specification. So on the left, we have different COBO inputs. So you can see here's my data type. Here's the label. So this is what was actually asked by the enumerator. And here's the question ID. And once I have
wait, sorry. Actually, I think we're still seeing Excel.
Okay,
yeah, we still see Excel.
Sorry.
No worries. That's why I asked. Awesome.
That was good.
So what I did is I copied from Excel. I took that type, I took that question label, and I took that name. And those are usually the three things that I need to really do this mapping exercise. I put them into the spreadsheet, and there's this nice template that we can share with folks that we can use. And I think Diane has even gone a step further and kind of making some other additional template changes and all that. But basically I can use this as my starting point, and this on the left, I can see, okay, great. Here's what all my inputs look like. Here's what my COBO form looks like. And then what I can do on the right is I can start to think about how does that map to my destination database? And this is where, again, it's really important to know what your database looks like. So if possible, if you can ask for a database diagram, I think this makes things so much easier. So for the non so technical folks, if you're new to databases, you ask folks for, you know, a visual of your data model, an ERD is a lot of times what it's called, a schema, then maybe someone can produce this to you. And hopefully this is the very least is capturing the relationships between the different tables. And then you can start to think about, how do I take this one really long sharks and rays form and then map it across? We have, just in this example here, we have 5 different tables that we're mapping to. Now, I imagine in practice, sharks and rays, probably it's a pretty big survey. It probably has many more tables. You can check out my table names here. It looks like I'm capturing information just about the form, the boat, some of the boat catch details, and then just some attachments, some of the images that we have going on. So that's kind of my sample data model. But now what we need to do is, knowing that we have this output, we need to figure out how do we translate the input to the output. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you all a mapping template. And I have this document here. And the ask to you all is to make a copy of what I'm about to send you in the chat, and you know, call it your own Google Sheet. But you'll see here I have on the left just what we had before. So we have this COBO export of a sharks and rays form. So here are all the questions we're asking the sharks and rays form. Then on the right here we have this destination database that we want to map to. And you'll see I've already started to fill in some of these for you. Started to fill in some of these things, but we have lots of questions here. And what we want to try to do is, assuming that this is our database, so if I flip over to this database ERD, I want to work with you all to see if we can figure out how to fill in some of these additional columns on this database. So this database ERD shows you your data model. It shows you all the columns. I've also created a separate tab. So this is kind of what the database table might look like. You might have a COBO table with this column. You might have a sharks and rays table with these columns. And so let's say that this is your database. What I want to do is just kind of take a moment and together maybe walk through some mappings. So we can take a quick couple-minute break now. And if you all just want to clone this copy, get your own spreadsheet set up, then we can come back in 5 minutes and we can do a bit of this mapping exercise together. And then we can talk about maybe just some more detailed or interesting intricacies of this process. How does that sound?
Sounds good. Do you want people to work separately on their own Excel, or should we all work on the Google spreadsheet?
So I recommend maybe everyone just kind of making a copy and doing your own Excel, but then we'll come back and we'll talk about it a little bit. So why don't we take a quick break now? But when you come back, you know, whenever you're ready, go ahead and just start to get to work I recommend first looking at the database output and then thinking about what COBO questions need to go to those different database columns. So just start to work on that. I'm going to go fill up my water, and I'll be right here too, just to start answering questions. And then I think after another 5 minutes of kind of working on this, we can start to talk about different things that come up. Cool. So let's come back in 5, but as soon as you're ready, go ahead and just copy the sheet and start going through this. While we wait for the others, is there anything that's been particularly challenging for you on the mapping side so far?
No, I guess it's more a matter of knowing I'm not the database manager, and I know that the database management team has some rules and way they build the database, and so yeah, it's more a question of knowing what are the conventions for the database to make sure that you don't put a field in the wrong table.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's always the trick, is like making sure that target, that destination is kind of, you have a good handle on that, and I feel pretty set on that. I think for us too, that's usually a lot of the challenging part with clients, is when there's a moving target. It's just knowing like, oh, okay, like that's what we should be mapping to, or here's that different variability, because otherwise it's just an iterative process, which sometimes is the case, because you get the data in there, and then you need to think about, okay, wait, actually we want to change the database this way, and then restructure it a little bit. But it certainly helps when you have someone who can really speak to that destination system quite a bit.
Yeah, and I guess last time the thing I struggled a bit last time when I did the vegetation one by myself, and there were all these repeat groups, and not the repeat, the select multiple. And I didn't know if I was supposed to, on the left in the blue columns, to use the output of the form or the questionnaire. And because in the questionnaire you have it's on one line, select multiple, blah blah blah. Yeah. And on the output, you will have multiple. You'll have one line per choice.
I see.
Many-to-many relationships can be complicated. I'm still not sure what the best way to reflect that in the template is, because it is kind of unique where it's multiple ID values. Well, the way we do it anyway is it's multiple ID values managed in like one table that joins them together. I guess there are different ways you could do it though, because I guess you could just have like some kind of delimited text field that has those values, as long as you're able to parse that on whatever you're doing for the analysis. But many-to-many is complicated.
Yeah, how we've solved that for before is sometimes what we'll do is we'll pull out a different sheet, like we'll almost clone the sheet and maybe create a new one. And then from there have like a specific many-to-many mapping. So Diane, if you can see my screen, maybe we would create something like, I don't know, country many-to-many mapping, let's say. And then you could have if you had your different database columns, you might have, let's say you have your main form table ID. So let's say, I don't know, let's say it's sharks and rays again, sharks and rays ID. And then you might have this looking up to some sort of country, master country table, like a reference table. Then you might have a country ID. And this might all sit on sharks and rays country table, which is a many-to-many. It's this table linking sharks and rays and country. And so on this many-to-many table, you might just have these two IDs. Those are the only things. Like you're just saying, hey, I need to link this sharks and rays form with this country. And what you need to do is then just define how we know how to map to the sharks and rays form. That should be the same form with the same ID. But the country, rather, what we should be doing is maybe there's some sort of like logic or transformation column here where we're saying find country where country code equals Kobo country or something like that. But you want to describe, at least hopefully first in just functional ways, like how do we look up that country? If we go into the database and we find that country table, like can we match on name? Do we have to match on code? And that's the hard part, is like, how do we match? And just thinking about OpenFunction's very dumb. OpenFunction doesn't know which country to use. You have to tell it exactly which country to look up. But that's one way we've seen it tackled. But you know, this I imagine can also just be captured in notes. It's something a little bit, I guess, Steve, for you and Diane to work out as you all are working on this together.
Yeah, this is a good way to do it too. And of course, having a good ERD is really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think that's the tricky part. And probably the bit of planning to do before actually getting set up on the integration side is just, you know, really going through the exercise of what can we do to match and look up things.
Yeah, and it's complex for WCS because we're trying to integrate a lot of this with an existing database structure, you know, like with our taxa table, which is enormous, but it doesn't make sense to reproduce a lot of data for each individual form or each individual type of project or survey. So yeah, it's a bit of a trade-off though. Yeah,
but that, you know, even if it's really complex, that's okay. I think it's just like doing a bit of that analysis before to be like, okay, like generally we use code, but if we can't find a matching code, do a partial string match based on name or something like that.
Yeah, it just takes a good amount of planning and thinking through what the scenarios are. Yeah, at once. Right?
Absolutely. But I think that was something that, you know, just we're learning right now in the vegetation stuff, even for us learning of just like, oh, well, okay, well, now we found most matches, but partial matches, and it just it's this iteration. And I think that's quite natural on all of these.
Yeah. And I've learned quite a bit about how Kobo actually stores data and how it sends it through the API. So that's been interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for anyone, if you're not used to, if these are new tools for you, I think my recommendation is really becoming familiar with your inputs and your outputs separately and doing a bit of like discovery of what does my Kobo form look like? What are my questions? How is it structured? What are the choices? And then separately, what is this database I'm mapping to? What does it look like? What is its data model? And like getting a handle on that metadata, sometimes it just fast tracks the rest of the process and the integration process. So a lot of times when we're working on projects, the first thing we'll do is we don't even talk about integration. We're just like, hey, show me your system, show me your system. And sometimes that just helps to build up that context of, okay, here are these two things that are very different that we need to try to fit together. And then if you have an okay understanding of both things, then you can kind of start to go through and do this exercise a little bit more quickly, because when you come across a Kobo question, you know what that is, or select one, oh, that's a drop-down question, cool. So I think that's the hard part, is like trying to find team members or folks that have done this before could like really walk you through these systems.
Yeah, but that's the value of everything that you've been going through over these past few days, you know, getting an understanding of Kobo, of OpenFN, and then just some like high level, how does a database work? How do you structure things? And then that really helps in the planning process. And I think hopefully what people can walk away with is just kind of like an overall process for how do you go from an idea about a survey to deployment on both the Kobo side and the database side, so that everything can potentially flow smoothly, you know, from the first iteration.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's the challenge of like investing up front and some of this planning and design. But in my experience, you know, if you're not in a time hurry, really taking time to do this mapping exercise and doing it right can save you a lot of time downstream in the development cycle.
Yep, it's hard to sell that idea to people who are not technically inclined.
and sometimes you just need to see the data. You need to see what the output looks like before you're iterating on it. So I think it's just something to keep in mind. But if you do have the time, the space, and capacity, highly recommend going through this process first. But if not, you know, get into a database, maybe use the automation solution, see what it looks like. And then after using the automation solution, you're like, oh, I want to reshape my data model. I'm going to actually build a custom integration. and you could have both going
Yeah,
on.
and that's what's great about this is that when you do make changes, you can set up separate versions and then see if that works for what your specs are, and then either just do a total refresh or yeah, find some other way to phase out the older versions of things. So it's a great solution.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Steve, for all your input on these initial ones, and just on the database support. It's been really helpful. Yeah, and so I think the message to everyone, integration, it's a living, breathing thing. It always needs tweaks, data changes. You need to kind of stay on top of it. But if you are working with a team where you have to interface a lot of times with folks that aren't technical, this might be a slightly more friendly interface for talking about your integration rather than your job code. So like a spreadsheet people are comfortable with. Okay, data elements, if I'm familiar with my organization's data, I might begin to understand, okay, on the left, I see these are questions that we ask in the field. On the right, oh yes, I've seen these data elements referenced in these different reports or dashboards that we have. So at least from my point of view, like this is usually the nice friendly way to talk about integration, and then also provides you that documentation and that specification for then actually operationalizing it in a technical solution. So yeah, so it seems like I think we have most folks back. Has everyone been able to make a copy? Does anyone have any issues there? Okay, pipe up if you do. Rita or I can help out. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through one mapping example. But if you are not new to this, please feel free to go ahead and start doing some mapping yourself independently. But basically, if I was to approach this for the first time, I got my Kobo metadata, I exported it to XLS, I loaded it into this mapping template. I then want to go and familiarize myself with this destination database. So I'm going to flip open to that database Erd diagram, and here I can see what this database structure looks like. So this is a sample database setup, and I can see that it looks like this parent master table that we're mapping to is capturing information just about Kobo data. So the submissions coming in, so I can see it's capturing the form ID, the form name, looks like maybe the geolocation of where that survey was administered, the type of form. So it looks like just information about my survey. So maybe it's Sharks and Rays Kenya. We're collecting this data. I see that I have 5 different submissions come in, something like that. Then I have my Sharks and Rays form, where this is where I'm starting to collect like key questions that I'm asking across all of my survey people that I'm asking to participate. So every time I go and I administer the survey, I might maybe asking them, what country they're from. Am I reporting this information on a landing site, at a market? So I'm specifying that survey type. Then it looks like I'm capturing different details about boats. So I know that there might be many boats. So there's a separate table, so I can capture multiple boats that might be linked to that one form submission. So I'm asking, what types of boats, what catch they're targeting. And then each of those boats might report on catch details. So what did that boat catch for today? What types of sharks, what types of rays? So there I can see I'm asking for like the type of their catch. So like what type of species and the weight of the catch. So how big was their catch? And then I have the separate table attachments where it looks like I'm also uploading a bunch of photos that I want to link to my form. So there I want that link to where that attachment saved in Kobo as well as the file name. So that's what my sample database looks like. And so if I were to go about this and try to think, okay, how do I get data into this database? What I might do is, column by column, kind of figure out where does this information come from. So for example, if I start with survey type, I might go back to my mapping sheet. And I might think about, okay, where is survey type defined? And it looks like there's kind of two main branches of survey. The survey might be at a landing site or a market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to classify survey as survey type in my database system. So I'm going to say I map this to survey type, and this column lives on my Sharks and Rays form table. So I'm going to specify my Sharks and Rays form table. And great, I've done one mapping. I say every time Kobo gives me survey, I want to send this to the survey type column on that table. So next up, I might go to country. So I find country, I go back to survey, or sorry, to mappings. And then I think about, okay, where does country come from? Okay, this is easy. Country comes from country. That's a straightforward mapping. So sometimes mappings work out really nicely. The metadata is super aligned. It means exactly the same thing. So then I'm just mapping this question to the sharks and rays form as well. Sometimes it's not so aligned, it's not so clear. And that's where I might need to do a little bit of thinking about, you know, where these different data points go. Or I might also need to think about how I want to transform the input to get the output that I want. So a good example of that is geopoint. This is a field or a question that's usually collected in Kobo. And what Kobo usually responds with us is one geopoint that contains both latitude and longitude in one answer. But in my database, I see I have these as two separate columns. So what I might want to do is take this one Kobo answer and split it up. So that way the first part, the latitude, maps to the latitude column. The second part, the longitude, maps to the longitude column. So in this case, you'll see I've kind of duplicated my mapping. I'm saying the same question, GPS, goes to two different columns here. And so I kind of duplicated that role, and I'm adding this comment and transformation. I'm describing functionally what I'm happening. So I'm telling my teammates, you know, hey, like a Kobo provides one answer, like I see here in column H. This latitude and longitude, it just provides it in one answer. I want to split this up. I want to take only latitude in one column, only longitude in another column. That way I can just really quickly run analysis on this. Because when it's all in one answer, it's really hard for me to plug in my mapping visualization on top. So if that's the case, here I'm describing that I want to take this one Kobo input, this really long string we have here, and I want to break it up. So I want to say, hey, just take the first part of that, and for longitude, just take the second part of that. So splitting up to latitude and longitude. Another example of a transformation is like country. So if I flip open, if I look at my Kobo survey here, I see select one, it's a drop-down option. And if I go to Kobo choices, I can actually see the different choices that will be given to me. So Kenya, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania. And so if I'm okay with these values as they are here, then I don't need to do any transformations. But let's say in my database, I wasn't actually capturing country names, I was capturing country codes. What I might want to do is in my mapping is I might want to transform these country names into different country codes. So for country, I might say, you know, if country is Kenya, I want to return, Rita, what's the country code for Kenya? KY? K, that's right. What am I saying? Cool. And then maybe the next question. Okay, cool. If my country is Madagascar, Charlotte, what's the country code for Madagascar?
MDG.
Okay, cool. And so in this way, you can also describe logic for reassigning values and things like that. So I would recommend kind of first exercise is like figuring out what goes where. And then second is, okay, let me take a look at my inputs, and let me take a look at my outputs. And is there any kind of cleaning or transformation I want to do? Is it as simple as taking whatever Kobo provides me in that exact form? Or do I need to do some additional work to process it in the right way? Any questions on those two examples?
No, but maybe just a comment. The geopoint question type in Kobo actually creates 3 variables. In your dataset, you will have I think it would be called GPS, where you have, as you said, like the latitude, longitude, and either precision. I think it's precision. And then you would have other columns, like separate columns with just the latitude value than just the longitude separately.
Okay, so maybe we can look to use GeoPoint as a source, but maybe there's also a separate source that we can look at. Is that what it sounds like?
Yeah, I think it's like GPS underscore either lat or latitude or something, but that gets created automatically alongside the I guess concatenated one.
Okay, cool. So I don't see that here in what I exported, but we can certainly take a look at that later. I think geolocation, particularly in Kobo, is an interesting one. So thanks for flagging that. And we can take another look at that.
So it wouldn't be in the Kobo form definition. It's like when you export the data from Kobo Toolbox, sorry, that then your data set would have those extra columns.
Okay, so one of those standard fields that Kobo adds in. So for extracting to the API, that then breaks up geolocation for us. And then we can use that rather than just GeoPoint. Okay, good to know.
Yeah, it's like the multiple choice questions. You would only have one question, like one field in your survey form, but then when you download the data, you have one column for each response option.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Then maybe we can go take a look at some data and actually look at that a little bit as a next step. Remy and Jesse, how's it going? I know you're doing this for maybe the first time. Have you been able to map any of these tables?
No, I have a question on the languages. Like I've seen there you have English.
Yes.
So suppose the data is collected in another language. So when people fill in the survey, it'll have them in English as well, or when someone picks it in let's say Portuguese or in Swahili, you'll have as in, okay, I'm just trying to think of if you'd like to have a database in another language, you can just pick the language column of interest and then map that language to have a database in that language. Or once you already have the database, can you be able to change between languages once you've already done this process?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a little bit of kind of comes down to what you're hoping to do in that database and that database design. I think just to clarify, and I think you basically when you fill out data in Kobo, it's always going to take whatever is in names. So if what's in name is in English, then that's what's going to output in your database when you're doing this initial mapping exercise. So if you're saying take the data value of whatever country selected, it's going to give you the names. But if in the form you're collecting you use French as your default language and names, then that value is going to show up as French. So it looks like in a lot of these Kobo forms we deal with, name, we see a lot of times folks are defaulting to English as that output. But as you said, Remy, sometimes there's scenarios where maybe for country, I'm also capturing that information in Portuguese and in French. So what you could do is you could get your integration up and running, make sure everything's syncing in English, and then you have this Kobo form definition that you can then upload to Kobo or to your database to then output these different Portuguese. Or in your open function job, maybe you have one mapping that says, I'm going to go back to the mapping sheets. Maybe you have one mapping that says take country and map to country, and that just returns the standard English. But maybe you have a second column in your database called country French. And maybe your source value is the same. Your source value is still country, but your transformation logic will be different. So rather than don't return name, country name, because that's in English. Instead, return French name. then what you could do is, if you kind of figure out that requirement, and you can set up in your job kind of have these two mappings, one that goes to the English column, one that goes to the Portuguese column, and then there's just slightly different logic for how to populate each of those. So that might be another way to do it. Another one might be just to get all your data in English, and then if you have coded responses, kind of map that to like a parent reference table. So if you had all of these forms look up to a parent table that had a master list of countries, on that master table, you might have countries in English, but then you might have French name, Spanish name, and things like that. And so that way you don't have to change any of this data that's coming in. It all maps to these reference tables that contain these different translations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. The scenario I had in, like, what I was thinking of is, let's say you have this data you've collected from communities over time and you want to give them feedback. You'd like to give it to them in a language that they're comfortable in. So probably maybe that's where it would be able to apply. But what you've explained, I think, would work. Thanks.
So Remy, I guess the tricky thing with the using different languages is that when we, let's say you have all your species of sharks and rays and you want to have a graph showing in each country or in each landing site what is the distribution of the sharks and the ray species that you found. If like for the Mozambique form, instead of species, you use the Portuguese name of species, for example, which I can't remember which is, but anyway, if you use that name, then your database won't analyze those species question in Portuguese, because you basically write one script that works for all the data. And so we don't really have the resources to create, 4 or 6 times the same script for the 6 languages. So the easier is just to create one script that will work for all the data. And so that's why we create the name in English, and that's why we use those names to analyze the data. But now for showing back the results to the communities, which is really important, and we should do that all the time. I guess the easiest is that after you download, so on the website, on the database, you have the way to, we'll build some graph visualization that you can download. And so once the analysis are done and the graphs are done, then you can download it and just change the titles to put in the languages that you want. I think that would be the easiest.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So I think the takeaway there, a lot is possible. It's just figuring out how much work do you want to do now versus in the integration process versus downstream. And it might be simpler just to get one integration up and running for one language, and then downstream, okay, then map it back to these other languages, or kind of build out these reference tables that contain those translations. But something that we're also working on as part of this automation solution, and that can certainly be leveraged for the custom solution as well, as building out this data dictionary. So trying to export these COBO form definitions and getting that into the database as well. And so then that allows you to just like quickly look up, hey, what did we ask in this COBO form, or what languages do we survey people in? And then in the database itself, be able to pull out those different choices and do some of that translation work. Because it's certainly tricky with translations. It's just like extra layers on top of what you already have. But that's why I think, whatever you put in that name column, just pay careful attention to that, because that is the default that will be referenced throughout. So not just for question names, but also if you have choices questions in your survey, just note that COBO choices also have names. So you might have many different labels, but names are ultimately what we need to do to go map to the database. So if your names look very different than your database names, there's going to be a bit more mapping work. So again, if in your database you only have country codes, but in your survey form you have names, that's fine. You can still integrate, but you need to figure out what that rule is for transforming the two. Versus if you are able to align your names, your codes, and your COBO survey with what's going on in your database system, it's going to make it a lot more simpler. Because then you're just saying, great, just take whatever's a name and put that to the database. I don't need to do any more thinking behind it. So that's just the extra bit of analysis of something that I recommend doing, is just really taking a look at what you're getting at names and some of these standard choices and doing, if you can align that with your database, it just makes the integration a little bit less complicated. But if you can't, that's fine too. But just a bit more work at this stage of analyzing what those mappings should look like.
Maybe from what we're doing, it seems like from understanding, it's like we are doing data cleaning and clustering data based on to broader categories, which will make it easier for analyzing data. Is that correct, or is that the case?
Is that to me, Jesse, or is that to a team member?
Yeah, it's a question generally.
So
yes, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. Do you have an example, maybe?
For example, we're picking options from the database, and then we are trying to map out that to a mapping where you are right now. Like we are assigning, is it like if it's a country, we assign country, and then what we hope it returns in the end. So I feel like it's more of like data cleaning, or I'm just figuring out at what stage is this process in the entire before you get to the part of analyzing data.
Yeah, so you might do that now. It depends on, like, are you catching these things now? Are you already aware of some of these cleaning steps that need to happen? And if you are, like, absolutely, I really recommend, you'll see there's these like sample input, sample output columns that we put into these templates. And that allows you to quickly see, okay, like, what is the data that I get from Kobo and what do I want it to look like? And then you can start to, like, I need to do some cleaning, or maybe in my column, I have some sort of other question or my database, I have some sort of question that isn't explicitly asked in my survey. So for example, we know we're capturing country information, but maybe in my database, because of reporting that I'm doing, I'm grouping all these countries by region. So in my database, I have this column called region that sits on my sharks and rays form, but there's no region question in Kobo. So if that's the case, then what I might do rather is use another field or set of fields to inform how that region question should be filled out. So if I know I have country, then I can say, okay, great. If country is Kenya, then I want to return East Africa as an example. And then if it's Mozambique, return Sub-Saharan Africa or something like that. And so in that way too, you can add data in a way. So if you know you have other data to be collecting, you can almost in a way create data that's based off of other data points. So it sounds like that might be some use cases on your side, Remy, to think through at this stage.
Yeah.
Or sorry, Jesse.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense to go through this process. Yeah, I think I get where we are at, because so this process has to be done when you designing a form, or what stage does this process comes in?
So this is when you're ready to integrate. So you have your form, you have your database. I guess it's my question to you is when are you designing a form? Do you design a form for a database, or do you design a form separately and then you have a database separately? So for every use case, that will look a little bit different. But when you are ready to integrate, you're ready to connect the two, and you know what your form looks like or is starting to look like, and you know what your database looks like or is starting to look like, you can begin doing this exercise. And again, the output of this exercise is this specification that's going to tell you how to go use OpenFN to set up an integration. And so depending on kind of how your approach is to this process, you might choose to prototype the integration, and just like based off your form in its current state, based off your database in its current state, you just want to integrate just to start to see the data. And then once you start doing analysis, then you come up with new requirements. So then you're like, okay, well now I want to group countries by regions. So let me add this in. like that's inevitable because the more you can start using your data, the more you're going to want to reshape it and to model it, and you'll probably keep coming back to this. But if your database is changing all the time and your COBO form is changing all the time, it might not be the best time to do this exercise, because then your inputs are changing. So you do all this analysis to figure out how does my input go to my output, and then you go to set up the integration, your input's gone, the question's gone, it's been removed from the form. So I think that's where we do recommend kind of usually approaching this step when you have kind of stable systems, but certainly expect iteration. I think that's something that you can absolutely easily do and will do. But yeah, I'm not sure, Diane and Charlotte or Steve, you have any experience from, I don't know, thoughts to share from your experience? Totally cool if not. Cool. Well, I guess we're almost at time here. Remy and Jesse and Charlotte, and I think some of the folks that are a bit newer to this mapping exercise, any other questions just on mapping and you know what this is, how we do it, why it's useful?
I feel like maybe for some of the things, it might be easier to start with, like, rather than extracting each question from your COBO form. Maybe in some cases it would be better to extract the columns from the data set that is generated from that COBO form. It depends on the cases. I guess for most of the questions, it will be, you know, one line in your COBO form will become one column in your COBO dataset. But in the GPS, the GeoPoint case in multiple choice questions, I guess that's when maybe it's easier to start from to use the dataset as a template, or like as your starting point.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So rather than starting with COBO, maybe start with the database and fit COBO into the database, as opposed to having the database fit into COBO in a way. So that could absolutely be another way of doing it. Maybe you export your survey, but you keep it on the side, and then you first load up all your database tables and columns, and then try to fit your survey questions into that. Is that what you're saying, Charlotte?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I was.
My brain's a bit fried, to be honest.
And Charlotte, that's exactly what I was talking about with Alexa before my internet shut off. But okay. I did that for a form. And what happened is that when you use only the output, you don't have the question type. And so then I had to remember for each question, was it, I mean, sometimes it's obvious that it says either in text or in integer, but sometimes I was like, oh, I need to go back to the form because I don't know if it's a select one or, you know, or integer or anything else. And so I tried to use that, and I remember it was a bit confusing, and so I can't remember what I used at the end, but I remember I had this dilemma too about which one to use.
And that's where multiple tabs are great. So maybe it's having your survey on one tab with the full export, and then on another tab is where you're doing this mapping exercise. But it's certainly, like, I'm sure, Diane, you kind of went through this. I kind of whiplash. I'm going back and forth between systems all the time. So I would say that this exercise, it does take time, because unless you really know the system that you're connecting with, you're kind of learning the system as you go, because you're like, okay, well, I know my COBO form, but where does this go in this database? And then you kind of have to figure that out. So while it looks simple, there's a lot of time and effort, and frankly, sometimes more time in the mapping than the actual integration setup. So something just to keep in mind, but also a great way to collaborate with your teammates and other folks that are using data, because other folks that are familiar with the data can be pitching in on this as well. Cool. Any other last questions or comments or ideas? You know, this today was just supposed to be introducing y'all to this exercise, and if you're going to be going and implementing open function integrations, we have some of these templates that we can share just to get you started. But then starting on Wednesday, we're going to come back to the platform a little bit and be like, great, now that we've designed these really cool integrations, we've come up with mapping specifications, how do we actually operationalize these? And so that's where we're going to get back to jobs. But rather than the automation solution, we're going to talk about how do we build our own from scratch. So how do we take these mapping specifications that we're outlining here in Excel and then bring those to life and actually test them. And then this is where we'll take a look at that data that we're fetching from Kobo. If you remember from those 2 fetch jobs, we'll see what that actually looks like coming in. Then we'll actually write this job to automate these mappings that we're specifying here. So that's what we're going to start to get into on Wednesday, and in the coming days, just kind of dig a bit more into that. But if anyone has any questions right now, I'll hang around for a couple more minutes, and if not, definitely the next time, happy to keep chatting mappings.